on the international movement of communities discriminated on work and dissent. Friends, we are having interpretation here. There is a globe icon and at the bottom. Please select that and choose your language. I think we have Hindi, we have Portuguese, we have French and Spanish. And we are happy that you're taking the time to come. This webinar is jointly organized by the Global Forum of Communities Discriminated on Work and Dissent. All of us know it as GFoD. The School of Advanced Studies, University of London, the Inclusivity Project, and together with Ambedkar International Missions and Baujan Scholars based in the US, Dalit Solidarity Network based in UK, Dalit Solidarity in Deutschland based in Germany, the Africa GFoD and the Africa Network of Dissent Communities Against Slavery across the Africa region, Asia Dalit Rights Forum, ADRF, Confederation of National Alliance of Quilombola Communities, CONACE, in Brazil, the European Roma Grassroots Organization Network, ERGO, based in Europe, Brussels and across the Europe, and the International Movement Against Discrimination and All Forms of Racism, IMEDAR Asia, which is based in Sri Lanka. I'm taking time to read this because it is now part of a global mission that all of us, hierarchies similar to the caste, have come across to form this international alliance of movements. Since the World Conference Against Racism, several of these marginalized communities, Dalits, Roma, Quilombola, and others have been appealing and advocating for the UN to address their specific concerns. Dr. Corinne later will trace these efforts in more detail. But after finding similarities of the social hierarchies and categories very similar to caste many in Asia experience, the similar hierarchies are found among Europeans, but especially the Roma community at the end of these, the Haratin, Soninke, and several other communities across Africa, and Quilombola across, especially in Brazil, and Palenque in Colombia, and several others who are yet to join this, have decided that there is such a similarity that we really need to come together in order to have an advancement at the UN level. So this important alliance of groups from across Africa, Europe, Latin America, and South Asia, we are forging new pathways for justice and at the international level to ensure that the communities discriminated on work and dissent, it's a very elongated name. Maybe we can use dissent communities, but that we will have to emerge as time goes, have organized ourselves, and we demand that we be heard at the UN. So this roundtable is an opportunity to have a long view, the overview, right from the World Conference Against Racism days to the present, and then especially the second phase, where you will see from 2019, where we have come together, formed this alliance, the Global Forum, and demand not just individually, but together, so that individually in each region and in each country, that we will have special mechanisms to address these communities. We are, after all, 270 million of those which are documented, but I'm sure there are millions more which are undocumented, and I would not be surprised that if we find at least over 300, maybe 350 million people who are suffering these exclusions and who are struggling to say that we need human rights as much as anybody else. So this roundtable, we will begin with Dr. Corinne Lennox, who will specifically talk from her book, which is Transnational social mobilization and minorities' rights, identity, advocacy, and the norms. So this uses what is very interesting, a concept which is called norm entrepreneurship to these efforts of Dalit and hopefully a declaration, or maybe they've already got. And indigenous people have already, indigenous people, RIP, and to see how we learn from these aspects of establishing a norm. So this book actually looks at several interviews with the leading activists and have come together to bring out certain key principles. And that is the first part where we will understand the principles. And then the next phase where the several leaders from these communities will share as to why this is important, that we are advancing as communities discriminated on work and descent, and not solely as Roma, as Dalits, or as African communities, which are CDWD communities in Africa across several, and as Kilambola. But together, we are also trying to establish these norms. So friends, I would like to introduce Dr. Corinne Lennox, before I invite her to start her lecture. So Dr. Corinne is a senior lecturer in human rights at the School of Advanced Studies, University of London, and also co-director of the Human Rights Consortium. Her research specializes in minority and indigenous rights protection and civil society mobilization for human rights. She has extensive experience as a human rights practitioner with NGOs such as Minority Groups International, and has advised governments, the UNDP, the Office of the UN High Commission for Human Rights, several indigenous organizations, and also has been fully extending solidarity and advice to the Global Forum of Communities Discriminated on Work and Descent. Dr. Lennox also served as the chair of the Dalit Solidarity Network UK and is currently the advisory board of Tom Lantos Institute, and is a member of the technical advisory group of the Global Center for Pluralism. Of course, she holds a PhD and MSc in International Relations from the London School of Economics, and MA in the Theory and Practice of Human Rights from the University of Essex. Especially now here, she's the author of this book, and I would recommend, and I hope, Corinne, you will also share us the book, Transnational Social Mobilization and Minority Rights, Identity, Advocacy, and Norms, which has been published by Routledge in 2020. I read it and have been fascinated, and I think we have a lot to learn in terms of the advances that we need to make so that we have a declaration and hopefully one day convention for the rights of the communities discriminated on work and descent. After her lecture, we will have a roundtable with all the leaders that have been expressed in the thing, and whom I will request Dr. Corinne to facilitate a discussion in terms of why this transnational mobilization of CDWD, Communities Discriminated on Work and Descent, is necessary for us to have not just rights at the UN, but very specifically have them translated into legal mechanisms and protections in our own countries and even subnational level. So friends, without wasting more time, I would like to invite Dr. Corinne Lennox to this lecture. Over to you, Corinne.
Thank you so much, Paul, for the very kind introduction, and thank you so much for this invitation and opportunity to speak with friends around the world about the findings from my book and other research that I've done with social movements. And of course, I've been honored to work with the various groups that constitute communities discriminated on work and descent in many different ways over more than 20 years now. As Paul mentioned, before my life as an academic, I also worked as an advocacy officer for an international NGO called Minority Rights Group International, which enabled me to work with many of the communities that we'll be discussing today. And in that work, I also was honored to be a participant at the 2001 World Conference Against Racism, which Paul joined, and perhaps others on this call as well, which, as I'll say in the talk, was such an important landmark event for global recognition of not only Dalit issues, but other groups seeking justice from various forms of discrimination. And since then, I've been really privileged to continue to work with the Dalit movement and laterally with the CDWD movement in many ways, including with the Dalit Solidarity Network here in the UK, more recently with GFoD, and sitting in global strategy meetings in places like Kathmandu and Geneva and New York. And in doing this work, I've witnessed some really important innovations in the international protection regime for minorities that I really felt needed to be documented, particularly because the usual academic research on minorities is focused on states, or it's focused on conflict, or it's focused on European experiences. And having worked with so many different groups on the international stage, I could see some patterns in the way that they were mobilizing for their rights, and how they were becoming strong transnational social movements. So movements coming together from many different countries. And I could see how they were doing this through their own agency. They were reshaping international understanding of their rights. They were defining their rights themselves through their own agency. And I felt I could make a useful contribution by comparing these different social movements, who were historically may have fallen under the heading minorities, but who were clearly developing their own identities and their own group-specific mechanisms and rights in international law. So I set out to study 4 groups that I felt had really done this successfully, and that was Indigenous peoples, Roma, people of African descent, and Dalits and other caste-affected groups. And in particular, I looked at the case studies of Dalits and other caste-affected groups in South Asia and people of African descent in Latin America, primarily because those 2 groups had made significant gains around the 2001 World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. So I started the research looking at this tremendous success of the Indigenous peoples movement on the international stage in securing new mechanisms, new recognition, new rights, even when there was opposition from powerful states. And I wanted to understand how and why they had been so successful, and how their success was being replicated by other groups. And the second thing I was interested in was how many groups were moving away from this minority label in a way that Indigenous peoples had done by framing their communities as peoples, in order to access new rights and to follow a similar path to the Indigenous movement. And all 4 groups were really rejecting limitations on their rights that were created by states, by governments. And they were mobilizing at the international level to create what I call new group-specific norms, both because minority rights didn't fit, but also to empower their own groups. So I wanted to understand how they've done this, their agency in that, and whether there were any commonalities between the way they had mobilized. So today I want to share with you some findings of that. And I'm going to first look specifically at the Dalit case before turning to some thoughts on what can be learned from this case for the new expanded movement of communities discriminated on work and dissent, CDWD. And then in the second half, like you, I'm really looking forward to hearing from key leaders in this movement on their views of progress in this activism. So let me just share a few slides here so I can take you through some key points from my findings. So you should be able to see the slides on the screen now. I've captured two images here. One is from the World Conference Against Racism in the top right-hand corner. Interestingly, you can only see men in this picture. In contrast, in the photo on the bottom left is the Dalit women leaders at the United Nations in Geneva. So let me just start by introducing some theory concepts that I used to do this research. And I drew from the work of two scholars of international relations theory, Martha Finnemore and Catherine Sekink. And they developed a theory called norm entrepreneurship to describe how activists influence changes in the behavior of states. So allow me to explain this a bit further. So the first question, what is a norm? Well, a norm is an expected standard of behavior for a specific actor. And in this case, that actor is states or governments. And rights are examples of norms. So rights are norms that we expect states to respect. And human rights are a widely accepted norm, even though they're often violated. And secondly, what is entrepreneurship? We know this term mostly in relation to business entrepreneurs, but Finnemore and Sekink repurposed this term to talk about activists and social movements. So they said norm entrepreneurs are those engaged in collective activism for justice, and social movements are examples of norm entrepreneurs. So what are the characteristics of norm entrepreneurship in this theory? So first of all, who are we talking about? Well, usually it's civil society organizations and actors with shared principled interests. And by that, they mean things like interest in justice or rights. What do? Well, they come together to try and persuade target actors, usually states, to comply with existing norms, or they work together to create new norms. Where do they do this? Well, often they act at the international level for part of their work because national level opportunities for advocacy can be blocked or ineffective. And how do they do this? They do it through processes of socialization. So that's about making target actors familiar with new norms as a desired standard of behavior, right? The way they want them to behave. And then persuading those actors to comply with those norms, to act in accordance with those norms. And this process is called norm entrepreneurship. So let's look at some of these strategies in more detail. How do norm entrepreneurs act at the international level? The first thing they do is they get organized. So the civil society actors come together to create a common structure for their cooperation. And one common form they do this is in transnational advocacy networks, or TANs, which are networks of various civil society actors united by a common set of interests. They're sharing information about what is happening at the national level on their issues of concern, sharing that with international actors, sharing that with other states, and they set common advocacy goals. And to give an example, today our panel is an example of a transnational advocacy network. And I've listed here some of the actors that are involved in this transnational advocacy network. This second strategy is successful framing of issues. So a frame is how issues are presented to different audiences, and they're important for persuasion and socialization. And we find that norm entrepreneurs often frame their issues as human rights issues, because this means they can access human rights institutions for their advocacy work at the international level. And the phrase Dalit rights are human rights is a good example of a framing strategy. We're framing Dalit concerns as rights and as human rights. And the third strategy is good use of political opportunities. And these can be processes like big meetings, conferences, it can be institutions, but all of these serve as spaces for and opportunities for conducting advocacy. And you can see I've put here some examples of political opportunities that have been useful for the Dalit movement, for CDWD, so the World Conference Against Racism, Human Rights Council, African Commission. We'll talk about those later on. And these political opportunities are spaces for socializing states, for persuading states to act in new ways, but they're also places where civil society can network with each other and to exchange information. So now that I've laid out the theory framework that I use in the book, I want to start by highlighting a few of the common strategies that all four groups that I look at in the book, that they've used to achieve their aims. And then I'll move specifically to the Dalit case. So the first successful strategy is about creating identity frames. All four groups created transnational identity frames, so frames that worked across many countries that helped to unite groups and to empower them by giving their own name to the collective identity, right? So that's Indigenous peoples, Roma, Dalits, Afro-descendants. They've all built strong organizational structures to help them work together, help them share information. They all had support from international actors, which was helpful to create space for them to meet, but also resources to work together, and also crucially, spaces to recognize their new norms. So for example, the UN has recognized new declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples and soon on Afro-descendants. In all cases, specific critical states both helped the movements, but also tried to block the movements. So the role of states as allies or as friends of movements is really been important, but also as those blocking the movements. And then finally, they've all successfully used these political opportunity structures at the international level to advance their advocacy. And particularly the 2001 World Conference Against Racism stands out. So let me now turn to the specific case of Dalits and their allies and norm entrepreneurship on caste-based discrimination at the UN. And I'm going to give a long view of this, starting way back at the beginning of the UN itself. So in the 1940s, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was the major leader of the Dalit movement in India, corresponded with W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the major leaders of the African American movement, about appealing to the UN So they put that idea on the table. That did not come through because Dr. Ambedkar, for various political reasons, switched the focus to national level processes, but the UN was in his vision. Move to the 1980s, and we find many Dalit diaspora NGOs at the UN. So, for example, Dalit communities in the UK, in the US, in Canada, coming to the UN to conduct advocacy about India. And the Indian response was, caste is a national issue. It should not be a matter for international concern. So they did not want caste discussed at the UN. But the Dalit movement persisted. In the 1990s, they became even more active in trying to use different spaces at the UN to advance their advocacy. For example, the Working Group on Indigenous Populations was approached. The Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination was an important early ally. The Working Group on Contemporary Forms of Slavery. So there was many different efforts in different UN institutions to try and bring the issue of caste-based discrimination. But it wasn't as focused or strategic as it could have been. And the movement was trying out many different places for advocacy. And it wasn't until the late 1990s that we start to see a stronger transnational advocacy network building up and becoming more strategic about using the UN. So if we turn now to this decade, 2000 to 2010, we see some exciting norm emergence, so new recognition of norms, and stronger transnational advocacy networks. The first issue on norm emergence centered around recognition. So an early problem that the Dalit movement had at the UN was the language of castes, which India felt was too specific to their country. And therefore, they said the UN should not be focusing on this. It shouldn't be an international issue. But with the help of some UN experts, the movement came up with a new framing strategy of communities based on work and descent-based discrimination. So it was in the early 2000s that work and descent-based discrimination becomes a new frame for organizing. We also had the creation of new organizational structures, in particular, the International Dalit Solidarity Network that brought together many new actors in the movement. We also saw in this period new UN studies, research on the issue, which led eventually to the adoption of the draft UN principles and guidelines on discrimination based on work and descent, which recognizes that this discrimination is a violation of international human rights law. And we also had the extremely important political opportunity of the World Conference Against Racism, where the Dalit movement and allies lobbied extremely hard, were very visible, but in the end, were not successful in securing recognition of work and descent-based discrimination in the final outcome document of the World Conference. But they were the most famous organization, the most famous group at the World Conference. So there was success in other ways. And following that, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination recognized that caste-affected communities could constitute descent-based communities in the meaning of that treaty, which meant that they should be protected by this treaty on racial discrimination, which includes discrimination on descent. Now, if we move from 2010 to the end of the 2010s, the movement really has continued to expand in this period, culminating in 2019 with the establishment of the Global Forum of Communities Discriminated on Work and Dissent, GFoD, which we'll talk more about. And really an expansion of the communities that are coming under this frame of dissent-based, work and dissent-based discrimination. So in this period, there are many examples of norm mainstreaming, so bringing more attention to this norm. For example, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2017 publishes a new UN guidance tool on dissent-based discrimination. The UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues issued a major report on caste-based discrimination in 2016. And on the slide here, you can see the woman speaking is, I believe, Salimata Lam from SOS Esclave, as part of an event with the then Special Rapporteur on Minorities, Rita Itzhak, who's sitting to her left. And this shows that at this period, the identity frame of communities discriminated on work and dissent is expanding, definitely to include communities from Africa, like Salimata Lam is representing in the photo. We also saw use of new political opportunities, for example, around the Sustainable Development Goals, the high-level political forum of the Sustainable Development Goals has been used by GFoD and partners, and there has been a stakeholder group created on communities discriminated on work and dissent. So we can see in this period an expanding and deepening of the transnational advocacy network and greater recognition. And I hope in our discussion in the second half, we'll be able to look at what's been happening since 2020 to today. But to try and move to a conclusion, I'd just like to share a few reflections on the outcomes that we see from norm entrepreneurship on caste-based discrimination at the UN. And the first major outcome is visibility. So particularly since the World Conference Against Racism, but this has continued well beyond that. And there is international recognition of caste-based discrimination. There's emerging and consolidating recognition of discrimination on work and dissent. And that's been a really important outcome, including at the UN level. And we've also seen new allies in supporting the persuasion of states to look at communities discriminated on work and dissent. So for example, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination frequently asks more and more states about this issue. That's down to the advocacy work of actors like the International Solidarity Network, many national partners coming to the UN to talk about that work. The European Parliament has raised these issues, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the United States Congress has raised issues. So many new international actors have come to support the movement. And what have been some of the key factors in this success? Well, the first is having these very broad identity frame of discrimination based on work and dissent. So that's enabled many new groups to come under this common identity frame and to move beyond only the experience of the Hindu caste system. And that's really been important to help make the case for UN attention to the issue because it's a global issue. And they've also been very strategic identity frames because it showed that the groups couldn't really easily be falling under the term minority. That term minority didn't really capture the experiences that communities were having. And the use of the term dissent is important for making use of the Committee on the International Treaty on Racial Discrimination. Secondly, they've had really strong transnational mobilization. They went from a point of just being loose advocacy at the UN here and there, different places, to a very well-organized transnational advocacy network, partly initially under the International Solidarity Network. Now we can see that expanding with leadership also by GFoD and others in the international arena. We have cooperation with international actors is very important. Even when there's been state opposition, those international actors in the UN and other spaces have been important allies. And the group has made important use of timely political opportunity structure of the World Conference Against Racism. But let me conclude also with a couple of words of caution, because there are some threats to norm entrepreneurship. No social movement is perfect, and they all face obstacles in their success, some of which can be prevented. So let me just draw on a few lessons learned from the other three groups I looked at that may be relevant for CDWD. So although Indigenous peoples, Roma, people of African descent have come together very well at the international level, they've had a strong so-called caucus, which is a organization at the UN around their advocacy work or regionally. There have been tensions within those caucuses. There have been conflict. And there is an importance of finding ways to resolve those conflicts and also to bring in new voices is really important. They've used strategic frames. They've united many different identities under these common identity frames, such as Indigenous peoples. But those frames can also cover over the many different identities that join together in this grouping. And those identities still want to be expressed. They still want to be recognized. And so it's important to find ways to ensure a balance between those specific individual identities and the global collective identity. Support from states has obviously been important, but there's also states that have significantly blocked progress. So it's important to keep socializing states to the cause. Political opportunities have been extremely important for bringing groups together. These other groups, I think, have been successful at creating spaces at the UN for themselves to meet. So, for example, we have a permanent forum on Indigenous issues. We have a permanent forum on people of African descent at the United Nations. These are spaces where people can come together. We need to see how similar spaces can be created for CDWD to come together. And it's important to remember that often groups have been stronger at the international level, where there is more opportunity to come together. There may be less restrictions because of the deep discrimination that groups face at the national level. Sometimes the UN can be an open, friendlier space. But we have to remember that any advocacy that's done at the UN needs to eventually come to the national level to be implemented. So it's important to keep that advocacy going also at the local level so that local level actors know about what's happening at the UN and also can do that socialization process at the national level to help implement the new norms. And finally, just a few quick things we could talk about also in the second half. Some strategies for CDWD norm entrepreneurs to be thinking about. One, to continue to invest in a strong organizational structure where there's good communication, where there's good information sharing for international advocacy, to invest in information. Information is a key source of power for social movements. And it's important to have information on how discrimination and work and dissent is affecting groups in many different countries, because that's important to show the global reach of the experience. And then finally, to continue that socialization process of states to find new allies at the international level, to continue working at the national level to ensure that national level actors will be ready to implement these new norms as they develop. So I'm going to conclude there. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope that there are some useful learning points in there, and I welcome your questions, and I hope it's useful for thinking about norm entrepreneurship in this movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Corinne, for your very detailed and very simply detailing the kind of stages that was necessary and that we have gone through to see that a collective norm at the UN is established. Yes, I think when you're facilitating the next session, we would hear a little bit more about what are the kind of possibilities and differences that are there. And despite them, how did they come together? And why is it important that we have this norm, which is actually impacts on the communities at the grassroots? But really, thank you very much. I think this is very enlightening to see. May I now open the floor? Pranjali, I think you have said that because of several restraints, you have requested participants to chat, and we will take the questions. Is that right? Or are we allowing people to actually ask the questions?
Yeah, participants who want to ask the question can either write it in the chat box or they can raise their hand and I will be able to unmute them. Raise their hand from the function that Zoom has. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much. I see if there are any chats, please let me know. But I see the hand of Aloysius Irdium and anybody else. I can only see. I'm not able to see the whole thing. So yes, Father Aloysius, you will need to unmute.
Yes, I have unmuted. Thank you very much, Corinne. It was a very, very enlightening lecture and very simple also. So we are able to follow this. And personally, I feel really very happy because I have been also associated with the CDWD for a long time, and I could really journey along with you the journey, the historical journey that you have made, and very, very, very enlightening. And your content also is very good. Now, my point is, you have very clearly indicated the various strategies employed by CDWD movement, and you have also indicated the various opportunities and spaces that the CDWD movement has used at the international level. And you have at the end also, you have indicated also there are certain strategies that need to be employed by CDWD in order to move forward. Now, what I want to ask you in this beautiful context that you have described, why is it that the UN mechanisms have not been able to open themselves to this CDWD community's aspirations, even though evidences have been given and established? But still, I think, why is it that the UN agency structures have not yet officially opened to come forward to a declaration, so to say? Are there still any flaws on our part or limitations on our part? Or are there any other spaces in the UN structures which need to be exploited or used by us? Or do we need also any more evidence that is required to be able to present our case more forcefully and more powerfully? If you can help us also with a clarification on this, it would be very helpful for CDWD in the future to see in what way we could reshape or redesign or even reinforce our own strategies in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Corinne, can we gather a few questions and then you can, just so that we are able to, I know you're noting it down. May I request Samir Anwar, please?
All right, thank you very much, Paul. And thank you, Lennox, for insightful lecture. And my question is pointed to Roma community in Europe, as I am a research fellow at the Center for Roma Studies and Cultural Relations, an Indian Council for International Cooperation based in India. So, as I find that there is data available, though it is not sufficient, especially the data by European Union Roma Strategic Framework and the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, that points that the survey of European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights in 2022 that notes that almost 50% the members of Roma community feel discriminated because of their ethnicity, at least in any of the important areas like in their daily life. And there is also the data of European Union minorities and discrimination survey 2018 that also reports that 30% Roma experience hate-motivated harassment and due to their ethnicity and due to their due to their ethnicity. And the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights also points out that the more than 48% general population of Roma community, general populations feel uncomfortable and abhor to have the Roma as their neighbors. So though this data is not sufficient because not accurate, because of their transnational mobility, the transnational mobility of Roma community. So the problem is there are the frameworks and conventions in place, whether you talk about United Nations conventions on discrimination of all forms of abolitions of all forms of discriminations, 1979, and European Union Agency, and the framework, a strategic framework of the inclusions of Roma community in the mainstream society. So these are not the binding of the states, because you find that the discrimination is a very...
Samir, I might interrupt you. Can you just be brief, because we have several other things. So if you can just say, what is the prime question that you have? In 30 seconds, please. Sorry to interrupt you. Can you unmute, Zamir? Pranjali, can you unmute Zamir? You have to unmute Zamir, please.
Yeah, sorry. So my question is that how these conventions can be translated into the practicality to integrate this downtrodden and marginalized community in the mainstream society, despite we have the conventions and framework in place, the statutory, even the national statutes and the laws in place to abolish the discriminations and all such kind of the racial discriminations or any kind of ethnic discriminations. So how these conventions can be translated into the practicality? Is there any kind of implementable conflict is there, or how the society can respond, the mainstream society can respond to these laws, these framework and conventions. So what is your take?
Yeah, thank you.
very much.
Thank you, Zamir. May I request, I know many of you have come with a lot of experience and knowledge. We have another roundtable, which will also throw some lights on some of the things, but if you can keep it short, and preferably if you can write on the chat, that will be great. Pranjali, can you share with Corinne? There are 2-3 questions I see from Ephraim, from Pallavi, and I think from Durga. So those also you might need to respond, Corinne. Abu Bakrin, thank you very much for raising your hands. May I request you to be very brief, only the question, not a comment, please. Thank you, Abu Bakrin. I don't see Abu Bakrin. Let's move to Muhammad Benejira. Can you unmute and also open your video? Introduce, please.
Merci. Bon, nous, de notre côté, au niveau des pays du Sahel et en particulier la Mauritanie, on a des groupes exclus qui sont en particulier les nomades. C'est des pays où le pastoralisme joue un rôle extrêmement important dans les produits intérieurs bruts des pays. La majorité de ces nomades ne sont ni inclus dans des enquêtes FSMS, ni des enquêtes SMART, ni dans des cadres harmonisés, ni dans des registres qui servent aujourd'hui de base pour la protection sociale et ont fait d'accès aux services, y compris les soins de santé ou la vaccination. Cette situation, on a attiré à maintes reprises l'attention des Nations Unies, mais elle demeure et elle est encore la résultante de beaucoup de cet extrémisme qui prévaut dans cette zone. Je crois qu'il est extrêmement important de mettre un accent sur ce groupe et de l'analyser afin de trouver des solutions. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Mohammed, from Mauritania. Mamadou has raised his hands. I cannot see, but Mamadou, are you able to unmute? And okay, I'm not able to see Mamadou. I think his internet may have been a challenge. May I request Pradeep Pariyar? Please, Pradeep. Unmute and also your video, and maybe you can start with introducing and then share, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Paul. I just have a very brief question. You mentioned about the word entrepreneurship in this context. So why do you use entrepreneurship? Can you elaborate?
Yes, thank you. I think what I hear Pradeep saying is entrepreneurship from a corporate point of view of, as an entrepreneurship, or non-entrepreneurship, which is advancing. And I think, yeah, thank you very much I think that will bring some clarity. With this, I think those who have raised hands, we have completed. And there are some questions also in the chat. I'm sure you would have had a look at it. May I take this over to you, Corinne? Also, we need to keep an eye so that we have at least 45 to 50 minutes for the next roundtable session. Over to you, Corinne.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul, and thank you for the excellent questions from the audience. And I look forward to perhaps exploring these as well with our second panel. So further, Alush's question about a declaration, how can we advance our agenda within the UN? How can we present our case more powerfully for a declaration? The most important thing to remember about the UN is that it's an organization of member states. It's not an organization of civil society. It's an organization of states. and it acts in the interests of states. And it is states that decide what declarations are adopted, right? So it's states that would negotiate a declaration, often with civil society. I mean, civil society plays a really important role in negotiating any kind of UN declaration. But it has to be negotiated by states if it's going to be a UN declaration. And formally speaking, a UN declaration is a resolution of the UN General Assembly. So you have to go through all the different stages of the UN to get to that point. So every state in the world would have a chance to vote on whether or not to adopt the declaration. So that seems like an extremely impossible task, but we know many groups have done it, and this group can do it too if they come together strategically. So some of the things to think about, first of all, in some examples we've seen civil society organizations first draft their own version of what a declaration would look like. So that can be helpful because it helps states to start to visualize what exactly do you mean. The second thing is to show that it's needed, right? That a declaration fills a gap in the normative tools that we have at the UN. And I think CDWD has a strong case for that because you're drawing rights from many different existing treaties and declarations, bringing it together in a common place that really helps to target action to help CDWD. Then you have to show that it's a global issue, right? For many states, they'll still think it's only happening in South Asia, or they won't understand how it's happening in different regions. So the UN is a global organization. It needs to act on global issues, right? If it's a regional issue, it won't really take action typically. And then you need to continue to build allies among states, because it is states who will have to take forward a declaration, amongst UN actors that can support your calls for this. And you have to have a common voice. The movement has to have a common voice in asking for this, saying why it's needed. So those are the few things I would say on that point. On Zamir's question, he talks about research done by the European Fundamental Rights Agency, which is a really important institution at the level. And it's a good example of an international ally for the Roma movement in Europe, and the importance of information, right? That research shows the level of discrimination that Roma face. So a lot can be learned from that example. And the fact that it comes from an international EU body, the research, gives it more authority, right? So I think that's a really important tool that they've been able to use. But to go back to the main point about his question, at the end of the day, you can have treaties and declarations, but if the local actors at the state level don't know about them, don't care about them, they won't implement them, right? So the point I was trying to make about working always with local actors at the same time as working at the international level is really important, because you can do all this work internationally. If there's nothing done at the local level, then you won't be able to implement the new norms successfully. And then Mohammed's question about the pastoralists in Mauritania. And there has been transnational social mobilization by pastoralist groups. That is an emerging sort of transnational advocacy network. They have made attempts to look at a declaration as well, which is interesting. What struck me is important in your example is you say the neglect of rights of pastoralists has created conflict. It's created tension. And I think the message to the international level is, you know, our social movement is a peaceful movement. We come with solutions to these problems that also will help prevent conflict, right? And we know that all of the communities represented in this movement face violence every day. Every day they face violence. And so you come with a solution for addressing violence, for addressing conflict. And yours is the peaceful pathway rather than the pathway of violence or tension that can also arise when issues are neglected. So I think that's an important message to send. And then just in the chat sidebar, I can see a lot of questions about intersectionality. I think in some of the work with the UN, I think there's been good attention to intersectionality, and obviously in particular, attention to women's rights in these movements has been very strong, and the voices of women have been very strong. It's no coincidence that our panel is all women. So I hope we'll hear more from their perspectives on intersectionality. But I think that's an important point of solidarity as well. Through intersectionality, not only do you look at experiences of marginalized groups within CDWD, but you also can build solidarity with other groups, other social movements that are working with intersectional discriminated groups. So I think that's an important extra reason to be really paying attention to intersectionality. Thank you.
Thank you. Just two other things that we missed. One question was, why did indigenous communities realize the whole declaration, and why it is becoming difficult for CDWD to do that? That is one. And then also what Pradeep has asked in terms of is entrepreneurship. I think he was looking at the norm entrepreneurship. If you can unpack that a little in terms of, has it anything to do with the typical word that we use normally when we say entrepreneurship?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I'm sorry, Pradeep, you cut out the first time, so I couldn't hear your question very well. But to answer, what do we understand by entrepreneurship? So the theorists who use this term have borrowed it from business, right? We normally talk about business entrepreneurs. But the idea behind it is it's looking at innovative action by civil society to go out and advocate, to develop new norms, if you will, to create a new business around new norms, around new rights. So that's why the language of entrepreneurship is used. Importantly, norm entrepreneurs come together around what they call principled issues. So things like rights, justice, environmental issues, etc. In contrast to business entrepreneurs who come together around business interests, right? So that's the distinction for norm entrepreneurs. They come together around principled issues like justice, like rights. Why did the indigenous peoples realize a declaration? It took nearly 30 years to get that declaration. They started by drafting their own declaration. So they came and said, these are our rights as we see them. So they exercised their agency. They used their voice, and they wrote down what they thought their rights should be. So that was really the starting point. They also benefited from a new space at the UN. So in 1982, the UN created a working group on indigenous populations, which met for 5 days a year in Geneva. And they also secured a big amount of money to send indigenous representatives to that meeting every year. And that became the main space where they came together again and again and again to negotiate what they thought a declaration should be. And they had support from experts, from UN experts who were in charge of that working group. They helped them to agree a draft declaration. And then they moved to a second phase, which was a UN working group on the draft declaration. And that was a working group made up of states. So that's when states became involved. And then it became a negotiation with states, with governments, between indigenous peoples and governments. And that took more than 10 years as well. So in that meeting again and again in Geneva, discussing what will be the wording in that declaration. So there was a lot of advocacy. It was a long process, but importantly, it started with the voice of Indigenous peoples saying what they thought their rights should be. I think, did I capture all the questions, Paul? Or was there one more thing?
No, there is, I think there was only one hand raised by Abu Bakrin earlier. We called him, but he couldn't. I think if we can give him chance after the next round, more or less we have covered all. So thank you so much, Corinne. Thank you, participants. I recognize several stalwarts among here. I don't want to name names, but I'm sure you will continue to be with us. Siddharthi has also raised his hand, but Siddharthi, may I request that you do that towards the next roundtable, just in for want of time. So please, let's give a big hand to Corinne for the wonderful and simple way she has explained a very complex historical process linking with the communities discriminated on work and dissent and learning lessons. Thank you so much, Corinne. Thank you, participants. You've been really very disciplined in raising your questions. So I now hand it over to Corinne to invite the next, to take responsibility for the next roundtable, primarily looking at why we have come together and what is it that is going to help us move despite the challenges that we face and the diversity that exists between us. Over to you, Corinne. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. And I'm pleased to be able to moderate this second half where we have a really distinguished panel of leaders from the CDWD Transnational Advocacy Network, who are going to share with us their reflections on the social mobilization of CDWD, particularly since the end of the 2010s. So the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a tremendous coming together of communities. For me personally, it's very interesting because my research was about how, Roma, people of African descent, and Dalits work together, sometimes in solidarity, but often alongside each other. And now the coming together under a common identity frame, I think, is a really exciting new direction. And our 4 speakers today have been working with very diverse groups of people who all have their own distinct identities. They're existing in 4 different regions in the world, and bringing them together is very challenging. But I think the CDWD movement has demonstrated that this is possible, and also that it can be done successfully. And so we've asked them to give their personal reflections today on how this transnational social movement has been working together, how they've been developing norm entrepreneurship around discrimination based on work and dissent. And we'll have a chance to ask them some questions. So I welcome feedback from the audience as well. So we have 4 panelists to join us today. I'm just going to introduce them briefly. I'll introduce all 4 panelists, and then I'll give them each the floor to speak. So our first panel member is Queen Deseng, and she is the UN Program Specialist for Africa for the Inclusivity Project and the Global Forum of Communities Discriminated on Work and Dissent. She is based in Cameroon. She's a human rights expert and specializes in managing physical and digital security for activists and defenders. She consults on human rights issues, advocating for the rights and recognition of communities discriminated on work and dissent, particularly in West Africa. Queen holds a degree in humanitarian action and certificates from the University of Georgia in African civic management and the University of Basel in documentation and archiving. She is an alumna of the 2019 Young African Leaders Program by Friedrich Ebert Stiftung She's an advocate for CDWD, and she leads the initiatives of GFoD across Africa. So she will be our first speaker. Allow me to introduce our 4 speakers before I give the floor. Our second speaker is Vercelin Francisco Diaz. She is a prominent Quilombola advocate, researcher, and activist. She's pursuing a PhD in law at the University of Brasilia and holds a master's degree in agricultural law from the Federal University of Goiás. She also earned a diploma in international studies in strategic litigation in indigenous law from the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru. She has served as a legal advisor for Terra de Direitos. Currently, she is the legal advisor and legal coordinator from the National Coordination of Articulation of Black Rural Quilombola Communities, CONAP. And she volunteers with the Quilombo Kalunga Association. And she is the senior rights expert with the Global Forum of Communities Discriminated on Work and Dissent with GFoD. She advises the Council for Sustainable Economic and Social Development of the Presidency of the Republic and is involved in the Observatory of Human Rights, the National Forum for Racial Equity in the Judiciary, and the Quilombola Working Group of the National Council of Justice. Next, we have Gabriela Hrabanova. She is a prominent Romani human rights activist in Europe with extensive experience in advocating for Roma rights across government and civil society sectors at the national and European level. She joined the European Roma grassroots organizations, ERGO, a network in 2011 and has served as the director since 2017. In the Czech Republic, Gabriela worked as the director of the Roma Office for the Council for Roma Minority Affairs, coordinating strategic efforts for Roma integration. And she played a key role in the Czech presidency of the EU, contributing to the adoption of the 10 common basic principles for Roma inclusion and organizing the first EU Roma platform. She founded the digital platform romareact.org and coordinated the Alliance Against Anti-Gypsyism. She serves on the board of the Raw Media Foundation and was a member of the advisory panel to the director of the Fundamental Rights Agency, which we spoke about earlier. She's also a co-founder of GFoD and integrates Roma perspectives into broader anti-discrimination efforts. And then finally, Bina Pelical is the first Dalit woman to speak at the United Nations. She is the General Secretary of the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights and chair of the Asia Dalit Rights Forum. For more than a decade, she has championed Dalit economic rights at the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights, advocating for policy changes at central and state levels to benefit marginalized communities, including Dalits and tribal or Advocacy people, and ensuring Dalit women are included in policy formulation. Her work especially focuses on economic justice and gender equity. She has led numerous campaigns, trained Dalit and Advocacy individuals on budget rights, fiscal accountability and governance, and as head of Asia Dalit Women's Economic Empowerment Program, she empowers Dalit women across South Asia. Her work also extends to the UN mechanisms. She has collaborated with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva and the High Level Political Forum in New York. So it's a very distinguished panel with a tremendous amount of experience. So we're honored to have you all here together to speak. So I would like to remind panelists, we do unfortunately have a short amount of time together. So if you can take the floor for about 5 to 7 minutes, that would be helpful. So our audience can ask you questions. So I'd like to first invite Queen Biseng to take the floor. Queen, please.
Thank you so much, Corinne, for the insights you shared during your presentation. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about social mobilization and communities discriminated on work and decent with regards to the African perspective. First, I would like to say that communities discriminated on work and decent in Africa suffer several forms of distinction, exclusion, and restriction based on inherited status such as caste, present or ancestral occupation, family, name, birthplace, community or social origin, and even place of residence. They also face profound social, economic, and political marginalization. And these discriminations affect every aspect of their single life, including their ability to secure dignified employment, access to education, access to healthcare, and even their full participation in societal activities. So social mobilization has emerged as one of the critical strategies in addressing these inequities and advocating for the rights and the promotion of the communities discriminated work and decent. So addressing these issues is very crucial and in achieving social justice and also equality. Now, ensuring that communities discriminated or work and decent are protected and promoted is not just a moral imperative, but very essential for the overall development of the African society. So we now see that social mobilization comes in as playing a vital role in addressing this issue and driving a change. When we look at communities discriminated work and decent in the concept of Africa, it mostly involves the groups and communities coming together to advocate for social change. And I would like to share some concrete examples at different stages and different levels within Africa, ranging from the local level, the national level, and even looking at the Pan-African level very briefly. At the local level, these communities are engaged by their leaders to form local advocacy groups. They organize campaigns, protests to raise awareness about the treatment made to them and issues concerning their welfare. Protests are taken to local chief palaces and local government area councils and secretariat to table their grievances and demand for social justice. These actions are taken to bring forth the lingering challenges within the communities, leading to reduce the stigma and discrimination. For example, in Nigeria, in the Kano East local government of Enugu, there is the Uruku community made up of 3 villages, namely the Omwode, the Omwachini, and the Onogu. Labeled the Omwode village as descendant of the Osus, who are communities discriminated work and decent, and these have limited social interaction with the rest of the community. And strangely, the other 2 villages cannot intermarry with the people of Omwede. The discrimination was also extended to worship places in church, which can hardly appoint the people of Omwede to position of responsibility. We see that this class of ostracism is operating in such a way that any person from the other side of the community who talks or even greet any person from a model pays a fine higher up to 1,000 naira. And because of this situation, the Omwode people operate their own local market. They have their own schools, different from the Eke Oroko market, which is owned by the Emochu and the Onogu. However, social mobilization of the Osu communities through the protests and advocacy in the local government of Anambra State yielded positive results, and this caused the community to fully integrate their Osu population into the mainstream of the community. This is a vivid example of the local mobilization stage. I would also like to mention that there is a similar case in the Gambia, in the Bazi region, within the Koina community, where the lower caste groups are discriminated by the so-called nobles, who regards them as slaves, thus excluding them from schools, most public places, and even graveyards. They also burn down their homes, assault and aggress them physically. This ill treatment has led to a court case. The diaspora from the lower caste initiated a movement called Gambana International with a local representation in the community. And so far they were able to build their own mosque, they were able to build their own schools, they paid the fee for the case court and have secured a positive judgment in their favor. At national level, social mobilization has been recorded within the CDWD in Africa to push for legislative reforms, create more awareness, and to ensure more resource allocation. For example, the national protest or the peaceful march every 29 April in Nouakchott by the leaders of the Aratin community in Mauritania to demand for more rights and the enforcement of existing laws against slavery. The peaceful march is held every year on the anniversary of the publishing of a manifesto for political, economic, and social rights of the Aratins, who are descendants of slaves and face marginalized exclusion. The manifesto proposed the creation of preferential education zones in the areas of the countries that face extreme poverty in order to put an end to the inability of Aratins to read and write, and the effective implementation of the law against slavery. The manifesto has served as a cornerstone document for the Aratin movement, guiding advocacy and mobilization efforts. Though slavery was officially forbidden in Mauritania since 1987, the phenomena continued. In the beginning of March 2014, the government in Nouakchott adopted a roadmap for the eradication of slavery, drafted with the help of the UN to fight against this phenomenon. At the end of December 2013, the Mauritania government announced the creation of a special court tribunal to charge with judging the crimes of slavery, which was until then dealt by the ordinary courts. 9 months earlier, it had set up a national agency charged with financing micro-projects that benefits the former slave. The national level mobilization effort by the Aratin in Mauritania have made significant strides in advocating for their rights and challenging systematic discrimination. The publication of the Aratin Manifesto and subsequent protests, such as the March 29, have played a pivotal role in drawing attention to their plight and pushing for legal and policy reforms. In Mauritania, we have the Initiative for Resurgence of the Abolitionist Movement, ERA Mauritanie, which is an anti-slavery group headed by Biram Daabed. We have other prominent local social justice groups in Africa, such as Gambana, Gambia, which has a bigger movement led by the diaspora in this community known as Gambana International. We have the Boro Cultural Association, Boskuda in Cameroon, Temed in Mali, Timidria in Nigeria, just to name a few who fought major issues concerning discrimination and exclusion. Looking just at the Pan-African regional mobilization, the Global Forum of Communities Discriminated on Work and Descent is making effort in this regard, networking and linking this movement across Africa. GFoD Africa has been formed to coordinate this effort. So far at regional level, GFoD has submitted 2 resolutions within the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. The first resolution was on the promotion and the protection of communities discriminated on work and descent. And the second resolution was access to education for these same communities, which was submitted together with Lawyers Without Borders. And we continue pushing advocacy for these resolutions to be adopted. When I glance at the norm entrepreneurship at the UN, GFoD has mobilized several groups across Africa together with the Roma from Europe, you will hear from them, Dalit from Asia, Kilambola and Praleke from Latin America, to appeal for a norm at several UN bodies, SDGs, Finance for Development, and Commission on the Status of Women, demanding for a resolution towards a declaration on the rights of communities discriminated on work and descent. I will not end without mentioning social media mobilization. GFoD plans to create a social media platform that will bring on board leaders of all communities discriminated on work and descent with the aim of sensitizing and mobilizing them for advocacies, campaigns and protests in their various localities. These campaigns and protests shall take place on the same day across the whole communities to send a strong message to the government across Africa to prioritize the plight of communities discriminated on work and decent. It will also align itself with a broader human rights campaign across the globe. And this will bring about the global convergence towards the demand of a UN declaration protecting and promoting the rights of communities discriminated on work and decent. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Queen, for a really passionate presentation of what's happening at the national and regional level in Africa. And I think it shows the value of coming together across borders to share the examples of good advocacy, of successful advocacy that you shared. And I also really like this example of the Haratine Manifesto, how coming together on a common agenda has been really powerful for the group. And also the sharing of information across the social media platforms is a really important strategy. Thank you for that. So our next speaker I'd like to invite is Bercelén Francisco Diaz, who's joining us, I believe, from Brazil today. Bercelén, you have the floor. Thank you.
Bom dia a todos, né? Aqui no Brasil é manhã, alguns lugares é madrugada, outros são tardes, né? Gostaria de cumprimentar a todos, agradecer por estar aqui compartilhando mais um momento, né? Agradecer a Corinne, né, pela apresentação dos dados da pesquisa, né, da análise sobre a situação das comunidades discriminadas aí em relação aos nossos companheiros de lutas, do fórum. Acho que trouxe bastante coisa aí para a gente discutir, inclusive trazer reflexões também com relação às outras comunidades também, a partir de questões levantadas. Agradecer a Queen também pelas colocações e aí também trazer aí o quanto que está sendo a luta, né, a contexto na Mauritânia, enfim, nas regiões de África. Enfim, cumprimentar a Bina, que é a pessoa que eu sempre falo bastante aqui no Brasil, para o coletivo de mulher, que eu quero trazer Bina ainda para dialogar com o coletivo de mulheres da CONAC, é a Gabriela. Eu conheci, já tenho encontrado em alguns momentos, mas estou conhecendo agora nesse encontro. Bom, trazer um pouquinho sobre a situação aqui no Brasil com relação às comunidades discriminadas no Brasil e na América Latina, né? E eu falo de um contexto que é mais um contexto de comunidades negras, né? Que é a comunidade onde pertence. Eu sou quilombola da comunidade Calunga, aqui no estado de Goiás, e como já foi colocado, coordeno a assessoria jurídica da CONAC, que é uma coordenação nacional de articulação das comunidades negras rurais quilombolas, uma organização negra, criada em 95, né, para organizar e defender nacionalmente os direitos, né, e lutar também por garantias das comunidades quilombolas aqui no Brasil. Ou seja, garantia de comunidades, e aí dessas comunidades negras, né, as comunidades quilombolas, que são comunidades minoritárias, que resistiram ao processo de escravização durante o desenvolvimento da colônia brasileira, né, e resistiram até hoje durante a redemocratização do Estado brasileiro, com suas formas, diversas formas, né, de resistência, resistir à sua culturalidade, seu modo de viver, religiosidade, muito ligado mesmo na raiz de onde essas populações vieram, que é do continente africano, né, que vieram de África durante esse processo todo de violação de direitos dos povos negros aqui no Brasil. E nós, quilombolas aqui no Brasil, temos lutado já há algum tempo, né, alguns séculos, vamos dizer assim, pela regularização dos nossos direitos históricos que por muitos anos foram negados, por séculos foram negados, e que hoje tem garantias específicas em alguns contextos, tanto nacional, a Constituição brasileira garante direitos às comunidades quilombolas, e internacional por alguns tratados internacionais que também a gente tem incidido também nessa garantia importante desses direitos fundamentais. E aí acho que, assim como no Brasil, outras comunidades daqui na América Latina A gente luta muito porque há uma garantia legal, num contexto mais geral de garantia de direitos. No entanto, esses direitos eles não são implementados da sua efetividade. E as comunidades lutam para garantir esse direito e, ao mesmo tempo, quando o direito é garantido normativamente, ainda lutam para que esse direito seja realmente efetivado enfim, 99,1% os direitos não são implementados, não são efetivados com relação à população, essas populações discriminadas no Brasil e no contexto de América Latina. Bom, a gente sabe que mundialmente, como foi colocado, cerca de 270 milhões de pessoas, povos, vivem discriminados em contextos globais, né? E aí a gente está aqui falando sobre isso, de várias regiões do mundo, sobre a situação dos povos, né, que são discriminados, né, seja por sua descendência, seja pelo trabalho, seja seu modo cultural, seu modo de vivência. Então, de certa forma, a gente está englobando aí um contexto muito geral de discriminação e que precisa ser enfrentado. E nós, né, temos trabalhado pelo fórum, né, a nível global, regional e local também, como já foi colocado por Queen, para levantar tanto dados sobre nós mesmos, pois o racismo e a discriminação por parte da sociedade, dos governos, nos invisibiliza, ou seja, não construi dados concretos sobre nós, sobre nossas realidades. Inclusive, essa ausência de dados, ela dificulta a implementação de políticas específicas, né, que devem ser construídas, destinadas justamente a essas populações, a esses povos, a essas comunidades discriminadas, que sofrem por séculos esse processo de discriminação e que precisa dessas políticas para se organizar, enfim, para sair dessa invisibilização, sair desse sistema de desigualdades, que é muito gigante entre as comunidades discriminadas e a sociedade de forma geral. Por muito tempo, as comunidades discriminadas na América Latina, e falo aí em contexto especial das comunidades quilombolas, da qual pertenço, viveram, ou seja, viveram apenas por mobilizações a nível nacional, né, de Brasil, e às vezes regionais de América Latina. Mobilização de luta, e aí nas lutas na reivindicação de direitos e garantias, né? Somente por volta de 2000 que começamos a mobilização a nível mais global, ou seja, e regional também, a fortalecer essa incidência a nível regional, que para a gente há uma dificuldade um pouco complexa em decorrência mesmo, e aí a gente coloca assim, que talvez não deveria ser em um país como o Brasil, da questão mais linguística, de cultura, porque os nossos companheiros da América Latina falam outra língua, né? E nesse sentido, o Brasil também, a gente de Brasil também se sente um pouco nesse isolamento, porque só falamos português, e os nossos companheiros falam espanhóis, né? São castelhanos. Então, há uma dificuldade nisso, mas recentemente, desde 2000 para cá, a gente vem tendo esses diálogos, né? Tentando vencer as barreiras linguísticas, as barreiras geográficas, e buscando nos organizar enquanto América Latina também, enquanto povos da América Latina que lutam por direito, que quer efetivar os direitos que já são garantidos, né? E o fórum tem organizado também essa luta nossa aqui, tanto de contexto do Brasil, tanto de América Latina, para mobilizar a nível regional, global, e denunciar essas violações sofridas pelas comunidades em decorrência do racismo, da discriminação, porque a luta a nível local e a nível regional, aqui no Brasil, quando a gente discute, já não era mais suficiente, né, para a consolidação dos nossos direitos e a cessação de violência, né, de violências de direitos fundamentais que já estão garantidos. Então, buscar essa aliança global, o Fórum Global tem sido uma estratégia muito importante para vencer essa invisibilização e essas violações de direitos. No Brasil, temos mobilizado por meio da CONAC, junto a outras organizações discriminadas a nível regional América Latina, pelo Fórum Global, que também temos capacitado várias lideranças. A CONAC vem capacitando lideranças jovens também para incidência mais regional e global, a nível de América Latina e também pelo Fórum Global. Hoje a gente estamos com um grupo, né, de mais ou menos 7 lideranças quilombolas sendo capacitada para essa incidência, tendo em vista que a gente também não tem essa especificação, né? As formações estão acontecendo agora, principalmente com essa luta, com o fórum e aí outras incidências que a gente vem tendo também junto à ONU com relação à questão de mulher, a questão do racismo, a questão da violência contra lideranças quilombolas aqui no Brasil. E nosso grande objetivo em contextos globais, é fazer com que os nossos direitos sejam garantidos, os direitos das comunidades discriminadas, elas sejam garantidos, seja no contexto de garantir normativamente, seja no contexto de garantir efetividade desses direitos, né? O direito à terra, o direito à moradia digna, o direito à alimentação saudável, com produção de alimentos, principalmente quando a gente trata de comunidades rurais, que tem possibilidade de ter a terra para produzir, mas não tem incentivos de governo para que essas comunidades produzam seu próprio alimento. Ao mesmo tempo, essas comunidades discriminadas têm que comprar alimentos processados, que são alimentos mais baratos, para sobreviver em seus territórios, né? Ao invés de incentivar essas comunidades a produzir seu próprio alimento. Direito à saúde digna, ao acesso ao sistema de saúde também, direito à educação de qualidade, e, em especial, o direito à vida, né? Porque quando você nega todos esses direitos, há uma negação também do direito à vida, à liberdade, de viver a cultura das comunidades discriminadas. Nossa liderança tem sido morta, né, tem sido executada em decorrência de luta por direitos no Brasil. Entre 2018 e 2022, 32 quilombolas foram assassinados no Brasil em decorrência da luta pela terra. Só no ano de 2023, foi registrado 3 assassinatos de quilombolas em contexto de violência, também em luta pela terra. Então, a exemplo do assassinato de Mãe Bernadette, né, a liderança quilombola, que foi brutalmente assassinada em 2023 no seu quilombo, aí, em decorrência da luta pelo território, os territórios com a moradia digna, acesso a água de qualidade, acesso a um território que possa produzir seu próprio alimento. Antes disso, seu filho também já tinha sido assassinado em decorrência da mesma luta. Então, os desafios eles não são poucos, né? São gigantes diante da imensidão e dos anos de invisibilização e de violência contra essas comunidades discriminadas, né? E aí acho que um deles, acho que a gente precisa avançar, né, na efetivação desses direitos antidiscriminatórios. Oi.
Thank you, Versalyn. I'm going to have to ask you to conclude so we can hear the next speaker. Thank you so much for your presentation and for sharing the experiences of the Quilombola community. I think it's very important that you note that there are constitutional recognition of the issues, but still failures to comply and to implement. And in that circumstance, sometimes international pressure can be helpful to try and get the government to act on issues. And we've seen that with Brazil and the issue of racism since 2000, as you outlined. Thank you so much for your presentation. Our next speaker is Gabriela Rabinova. Gabriela, you have the floor.
Good afternoon from Europe. Distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, friends. It is always a great honor for me to be here with you, and especially on this roundtable where we are discussing we want to discuss and reflect the history of social mobilization against work and decent-based discrimination, but also to strategize for the future, but equality and justice are tangible realities for all of us. Our collective efforts span decades, and through cooperation, we can amplify our impact. For me, coming to those meetings, it's always served as an inspiration. It's forging new pathways for justice, and it's ensuring that it's kind of ensured that the voices of CDWD are recognized and heard on the global stage. I know that it's never easy for any of us, but I think that this sort of motivation that we can give each other and the inspiration, it's actually worth of doing it together. in this context, I slightly changed my presentation, and I want to focus a little bit on our current situation here in Europe, because we just had European elections that finished practically 9th of June, 2 days ago, and it's for the first time since 2004 there are no Romani representatives elected to the European Parliament. And this loss of representation, it's actually more than symbolic, because it has a profound setback also in the fight for equality and inclusion. Roma community, also thank you for some previous commenters for giving some numbers. Roma community is an important part of the European Union and European family. We are practically a population in the whole world. In the whole world, we are making about 20 million, but here in Europe, we are from 6 to 10 million or 12 million. But according to the estimates, let's say we make about 1% of the entire population. And although Roma have been part of the European family for ages, we are still facing severe discrimination on all levels. And the discrimination also applies to the political spheres, where Roma are severely underrepresented. And practically what happened now with the European elections, we really believe that this absence of Romani voices in the European Parliament would inevitably affect the human rights agenda across Europe. Because without representation, the political influence of minorities diminishes, making it harder for the organizations like us advocating for the Roma rights and make the progress on crucial issues. And the European Parliament decisions directly impact on lives of minorities, lack of representation that threatens and perpetuates the cycle of exclusion and inequality. This impact also extends beyond the Roma community, because in the past we had in the past parliamentarian periods we had anti-racism and diversity group, which was an intergroup organized across the political parties, and it played crucial role promoting racial equality and fighting discrimination. But the leadership and the collaboration was the most coming from the Romani members of the parliament, and it was instrumental in these efforts. And even this group, it's at risk. And we know that without people of color, without any minorities, practically this agenda would be very much affected. And yeah, it's always like that. Where are the decisions taking place? So we also was mentioned that we have a Roma strategy in Europe, and this one is until 2030. So it's actually very probable that this European Parliament would already decide what will be the direction after 2030. And if there will be no Roma representatives, we don't know how many pro-Roma members of parliaments will be there. This strategy might be actually also at stake, but also the new budget of the European Commission. I know that many of our communities, we actually face even worse situation. We were never actually represented in any political structures. But I think that somehow, at least for us, that we taste how it is to have those people in place. And we have the last period, we have 4 members of Roma community in the European Parliament. Actually, last half a year, we had 4 people there. Actually, I could feel, and especially if those parliamentarians were women, how much we could do together, how much kind of they were able to share resources, how much they were actually offering the space and engaging us in their work. So that this is practically a very, very bad step. And not talking about the fact that the Europe goes right, that we have, it's not so bad as we were expecting with the European election. So, but still we have a quite slight shift to this kind of extreme right representatives in the European Parliament, and we lost a lot of on the left. The Greens, they're a little bit balanced, but still, it's not what we actually would like to see in this Europe today. But of course, I think it's this multiple crisis that we are living in. I think that's very much reflecting like what the politicians can offer these days, and the mistrust in the elites that we are seeing. But also, I see in a way that our role, and you talk about it, it's the work on the local level, on the national level, like how we can actually mobilize, what we can do for also people to believe and to understand a little bit more why it's important to be engaged. But in the same time, I also see that our people struggle, that very often their priorities, it's not who's going to be representing them on the political high level, but what they are going to eat or if their children are safe in the schools, right? So we are actually facing this imbalance of the needs and the priorities that are very much reflected also in like how hard it is for us sometimes practically to do this, do this work and do this advocacy. And then we might actually face ourselves in this empty space where we do things because we know we have to do them, but in the same time, the support from the communities, it's not so visible because the impact, it's not seen. So I really wish that although we are putting more on the shoulders of the NGOs, that I wish that also there is we are also creating this transparency and the trust that actually we have the reflection of the needs of the people as well, when we know how to kind of engage them the most, and that one day that, I mean, for us it's about the Europe, that the European governance will reflect the rich diversity which we are having in the European Union, but in general that practically all those institutions in the world will be able to reflect the diversity that we are living in, and that we would be able to mobilize people. And I really thank you for the space here to work on it together.
Thank you, Gabrielle. I'm sorry to cut you short, but we're going to lose interpretation shortly. And I want to make sure that Bina has a chance to take the floor. But I think you made the important message about representation in international actors to support movements is essential. Bina Pelikal, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Corinne. And it's such a pleasure for me to share this panel along with some fantastic women from around the world globally. I share and endorse a lot of things that they have said before me. Just one correction in my profile. I am definitely not the first woman to speak at UN. I'm almost embarrassed when I heard that, because there are many women who've gone before me on whose shoulders I stand. Here in the audience, it's in the participants and audience itself, there's Ruth, there's Durgaji, they've all gone before me. The correction is that I'm the first person to speak, I mean, Dalit woman to speak at the UN General Assembly. So just to be clear on that. I'll be very quick. I know that we have very less time. I have been asked to speak of our change in strategy from going as just Dalit rights to moving towards communities discriminated on work and dissent. I'd like to thank the Global Forum of Communities Discriminated on Work and Dissent for giving me this opportunity to speak at this very important event. It has been a long journey for us as the Dalit community from Durban in 2001 to moving towards a declaration at the UN for the most marginalized and disenfranchised communities. In the 1940s, I think, Corinne, you already mentioned this, that Dr. B.R. Ambedkar wrote to W.E.B. Boyce to inquire about the National Negro Congress petition to the UN, which attempted to secure minority rights through the UN Council. So there was some interest in Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in pursuing this at the UN, and therefore the inquiry regarding these. These were the first known efforts to try and engage at the UN through Boyce. Since then, a lot has been done and said about Dalit community, both regionally and globally. Dr. Babasaheb started the work on liberating and emancipating Dalits from the clutches of slavery. And from then to now, where, you know, different organizations have intervened at the UN, I'd like to trace some key moments in history that led us to this point. The National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights, the organization that I represent, along with several organizations, mobilized to go to Durban in 2001. And for the first time, Dalit rights was taken to the global stage and the UN. Post-Durban, there were many studies done, and the visibility around Dalit rights increased both regionally and globally. In 2013, the Asia Dalit Rights Forum was formed by Dalit-headed organizations from 5 countries of South Asia, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, and was instrumental in mobilizing on Dalit rights in the region and globally. And before this, Corinne already mentioned the International Dalit Solidarity Network, and other solidarity bodies around Europe that has done a lot of work, definitely both at Geneva as well as the EU. In 2016, as a result of the work of ADRF, it was a separate constituency for Dalits was recognized as at the Asia Pacific Regional Engagement Mechanism on SDGs, which is one vehicle that we're using, the SDG platforms globally, to bring our issues to the platforms looking at SDGs. In 2019, a global collective known as the Global Forum of Communities Discriminated in Work and Dissent was formed, bringing together various groups similarly discriminated in work and dissent. And that is where, and it is in this meeting that a joint collective decision was taken to move from just looking at Dalit rights at the global platform towards CDWD. And reasons for this shift was, while Dalits being the biggest contingent in the CDWD, I think about 160 million, if I'm right with my number, that's a huge group in terms of looking at the larger CDWD. It was not the only group that is discriminated based on their social location. So for the last 20 years, while Dalit rights has been visibilized through resolutions at the UN, recommendation 29 at the CERT, recognizing CDWD, resolutions of violence against women at EU and UN, still there was a lot of block from, various quarters, whether it be the countries, whether it be other countries that are supporting, and a lot of the discussion depends on, the countries that are having trade. And so there's a lot of support for countries like India that could block this. So there was an organic and a very natural progression towards CDWD, because that also included a larger group where it is not specific to one country, but to come together to form this bloc that demands a common declaration or mechanism to address issues faced by this community. And this was done to strengthen the demand both at the global level with a much larger contingent. The change in strategy has definitely given more visibility, has gained much more traction at the UN. CDWD is now a recognized term at the UN, both in Geneva as well as in New York. But more than that, because we are a stakeholder group, at the UN now in New York, in the context of the Sustainable Development Goal, we also have a seat at the table. So it's not just that we are there representing, but because we have the stakeholder group, we have a seat at the table. And these are some small steps that we have taken to move towards our larger goal or our larger demand of the declaration. I'll stop here. Jai Bhim and Johar.
Thank you so much for your brevity, Bina. I'm sorry we don't have more time owing to the translation concluding, but thank you for highlighting those exciting developments in the last few years under CDWD. And finally, I would like to hand over to Dr. Simona Toratkoi, who is the UN Program Specialist on Europe for Inclusivity Projects. She's a leading Roma activist in Europe as well. Simona, please.
Thank you very much, Corinne. As we conclude this significant event, carving a norm at the UN on the rights of communities discriminated in work and dissent, it's my privilege to deliver the vote of thanks. First and foremost, I'm very grateful to Corinne for her presentation. I think it's very important to acknowledge that we need more academics to put forward both our experiences, but also to document what is actually happening with our communities. And we also should encourage more and more community researchers and academics from our communities. But Corinne, thank you very much for your work. I hope our audience here can purchase the book. I pasted in the chat that we have a discount code as well. Then a sincere thank you goes to the colleagues from GFoD and the partners for organizing this event. I think we had a very nice reach out and attendance. Thank you very much, colleagues, for doing this. You have been instrumental in bringing these crucial issues to the forefront. Then a special thanks goes as well to our attendees. You had very active participation and diverse perspective, especially to the questions. And I think those have enriched significantly the dialogue we have had here. And that made this event more impactful for the conversation. I also want to express a deep thank to our interpreters. We need to acknowledge the language and participation in this type of events. It's very difficult, but I think this is what GFoD brings together, like trying to create enabling spaces for diverse communities to be able to participate and take an active role there, like express their agency. Finally, let us remember that today's discussion are just the beginning, maybe. As we move forward, let us continue to advocate for the establishment of a robust UN norm. As you might know, we are working towards a draft resolution, and I would encourage you all to follow us on social media, to check our website, and to get in touch and in contact with us if you would like to become our allies to carry this forward. Thank you once again to everyone who has made this event a success. And together we can carve out a future where the rights of every community is respected and upheld. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think with this, sorry, we have to close this webinar, but you can open your cameras and say goodbye and thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Goodbye.